My name is Daniel, and at 22 years old, I make my living exploring the dark, hidden veins of the earth. Some call me a caver. To me, it's more than just a job, it's an obsession. Guiding tourists through narrow passages, teaching them to confront their fears, and squeezing them into spaces they thought impossible. That's my day to day. But don't mistake me for a fearless hero. I've learned to manage fear, to tuck it away into a corner of my mind. Most of the time, that works. Most of the time. Caving wasn't something I planned. It began by accident during a family vacation when I was 10. My parents took us to a tourist-friendly cavern, complete with paved paths and bright, colorful lights. While others marveled at the formations, I asked the guide where the unlit tunnels led. His dismissive response, "Nowhere you'd want to go, kid," set something alight inside me. I decided I wanted to go where others wouldn't. Years later, I joined a local caving club. It was a haven for grizzled veterans with calloused hands and stories about getting stuck in impossible spaces. By 18, I spent every weekend underground, returning home bruised and muddy, yet satisfied. My mom thought I was crazy. My dad called it better than gaming all day. Now, caving is my livelihood. I work for a company running tours through a vast cave system, knowing every twist and stalactite by heart. But weekends are for going rogue. That's when I seek the undiscovered, where the pull of the unknown is irresistible. This weekend, rumors of an uncharted cave hidden deep in the woods an hour outside town captured my attention. The cave wasn't on any map. An old forum post hinted at its location. Follow the creek until you see a rock shaped like a bear's head. I set out early Saturday morning, gear packed, helmet, flashlight, ropes, snacks, and extra batteries. The hike was serene at first, with damp earth underfoot and birds chirping overhead. The rock, shaped uncannily like a bear's head, was exactly where the post promised. Behind it lay the entrance, a jagged opening in a limestone bluff, half concealed by ferns. Perfect. The entrance was narrow, demanding I crawl on my stomach. With my flashlight illuminating the void, I slid into the earth. The familiar mix of excitement and unease rose in me as the daylight faded. The first chamber was unremarkable, a low-ceilinged room with rough walls and loose rocks underfoot. Two passages led out, one sloping upward and the other descending steeply. Naturally, I chose the latter. The deeper I went, the cooler and heavier the air became. My flashlight beam revealed walls that closed in, forcing me to duck. The thrill of the unknown drove me onward until I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold, a wooden box lying on the floor. At first glance, it seemed like an old toolbox, perhaps abandoned by miners. But as my flashlight revealed sharp nails and precise corners, I realized it wasn't a box at all. It was a coffin. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A prank? A macabre joke? Nervous laughter escaped me, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. Curiosity nudged me closer. My flashlight's beam swept across the area, and there they were. 3 more coffins, arranged in a neat row. Identical. Eerily pristine despite the damp environment. Who had brought them here, and why? The coffins were spaced meticulously, as if someone had measured the distances with care. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I crouched before the first and gripped its edge. Slowly, I lifted the lid. The faint creak of wood gave way to a musty odor, and my flashlight beam wavered as it revealed its contents. A boy, no older than 7, pale and dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His small hands clutched a wooden toy. I slammed the lid shut, my heart pounding. It had to be a dummy. A prop, right? Driven by both terror and the need to prove myself wrong, I moved to the second coffin. Inside lay a little girl, perhaps 10, in a lacy white dress, her hands holding a porcelain doll. Her braided hair and peaceful expression made her appear asleep, except there was no rise or fall of breath. The third coffin held a man, his sharp features frozen in eerie serenity. He wore a suit, slightly frayed, his hands clasped over his stomach. The fourth contained a woman with long dark hair, clutching dried flowers. Together they seemed like a family, perfectly preserved in death. Above the coffins, jagged letters carved into the rock whispered a chilling message. We wait for the light. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at those words. My flashlight's beam trembled, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Then the air shifted. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, rippled through the chamber. Turning back to the coffins, I saw the lids begin to move. One by one, they creaked open. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the lids continued to move, each creak cutting through the suffocating silence. My flashlight's beam shook in my trembling hand, casting erratic shadows across the chamber. The boy was the first to rise. His small, pale hands gripped the edges of the coffin, and he sat up with an unnatural fluidity, his head turning slowly to face me. Empty. Unblinking eyes locked onto mine, and a cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. Next was the girl. Her movements were just as smooth, her braided hair falling over her shoulder as she tilted her head, studying me with an eerie calm. Then the man and woman sat up, their expressions devoid of emotion but their gazes intense, almost calculating. They moved as one, a silent synchronization that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my boots crunching against the gravelly floor. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The woman was the first to speak, her voice soft yet carrying an unnatural resonance that echoed off the chamber walls. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone both warning and accusing. The man stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "It's been a long time since we've had a visitor," he said, his voice deep and smooth, yet it carried an edge that sent chills down my spine. The children climbed out of their coffins, their small feet silent against the rocky floor. They flanked their parents, their heads tilting in unison as they observed me. The boy's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice high and lilting. Something warm, fresh. My stomach lurched, and I took another step back, nearly tripping over a loose stone. I didn't mean to disturb you," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward. "You entered our domain," she said, her voice cold now, devoid of the softness it held before. "There are rules here." I didn't wait to hear what those rules were. My fight-or-flight instincts finally kicked in, and I turned, sprinting toward the tunnel I had come from. The beam of my flashlight bobbed wildly as I ran, the sound of my ragged breaths and pounding heartbeat filling my ears. Behind me I heard their footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if they knew there was no escape. The tunnel seemed narrower than before, the walls pressing in as if the cave itself were conspiring to trap me. My shoulders scraped against the rough stone, and I nearly dropped my flashlight in my haste. A faint sing-song voice echoed behind me, the girl's words chilling me to the core. "You can't run forever," she said, her tone almost playful. A cold draft swept through the tunnel, carrying with it the faintest hint of decay. My mind raced, searching for a plan, an escape route, anything. The thought of turning back was unthinkable, but the deeper I went, the more the air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the cave were alive and aware of my presence. I rounded a corner and stumbled into another chamber. This one was larger, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the floor was littered with bones, human bones. Some were old and brittle, others disturbingly fresh. My flashlight flickered, its beam struggling to pierce the thick shadows. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't just a dead end, it was their lair. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of movement at the tunnel's entrance. They were there. The family. All four of them, standing in perfect stillness, their pale faces illuminated faintly by the unsteady light. The man stepped forward, his lips curling into a predatory smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice dripping with mock hospitality. "You've found your way to the heart of our home." I backed away, my heel catching on a bone. I fell hard, the impact jolting the flashlight from my hand. It rolled away, its beam casting wild arcs of light across the chamber. In the fleeting illumination, I saw the family advancing, their movements slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, desperate to retrieve the flashlight. "Stay," the woman said, her voice commanding and laced with a strange, otherworldly pull. "You'll find it's better to accept your fate." Ignoring her, I dove for the flashlight, snatching it up just as the beam flickered and died, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that pressed against me like a physical weight. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the faint sound of movement, their movement, scraped against my ears. My fingers fumbled over the flashlight, smacking it against my palm in a desperate attempt to revive the beam. A flicker, then nothing. I cursed under my breath, trying again. This time the light sputtered weakly to life, its beam dim but functional. In the pale glow, I could see them. They were closer now, their faces half illuminated by the weak light. The man's lips twisted into a grin, his teeth unnaturally white. The woman stood beside him, her head tilted in a way that was almost curious. The children, they were the worst. Their small, pale faces betrayed no emotion, but their eyes gleamed with something ancient and hungry. I backed away, the light trembling in my hands as I swept it across the chamber. The bones on the floor seemed to multiply in the flickering beam, each one a silent testament to those who had come before me. My mind screamed for a plan, but fear clouded my thoughts, leaving me with only one instinct: survive. "You can't escape," the woman said, her voice soft and melodic, as if she were trying to soothe a frightened child. "This is where you belong now." The boy giggled, the sound high and eerie echoing off the chamber walls. "He smells so scared," he said, his small hands flexing as if he were preparing to grab me. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I bolted toward the nearest tunnel. The air grew colder as I moved, each step taking me further into the labyrinth of stone and shadow. Behind me, their footsteps were soft but steady, a haunting rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing at points until I was forced to crawl on hands and knees. My palms scraped against the rough stone and my knees ached with every movement, but I didn't dare stop. The faint sound of their voices followed me, drifting through the darkness like whispers carried on the wind. "You're only making it harder for yourself," the man called, his voice calm and unhurried. "There's nowhere to go." I ignored him, pushing myself harder. The tunnel began to slope upward, and for a fleeting moment, hope flared in my chest. An exit. It had to lead to the surface. My flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. Panic surged through me as I smacked it against my palm, willing it to hold on a little longer. The slope leveled out into another chamber, smaller this time, with walls that seemed to close in around me. The air was heavy, and the smell of damp earth mingled with something metallic and sharp. My flashlight caught a glint of something on the floor, a rusty, jagged piece of metal. A weapon? I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly as I scanned the room for any sign of escape. The voices were closer now, their tones shifting from calm to eager, almost excited. "He's close," the girl said, her voice sing-song and chilling. "I can feel it." I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the metal shard like a lifeline. My mind raced, torn between fighting and fleeing. The beam of my flashlight dimmed further, casting the chamber into near darkness. I could hear them now, their footsteps echoing just outside the tunnel I had come through. They were toying with me, savoring my fear. Then a sound, a faint, distant hum that seemed to vibrate through the rock. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, and completely out of place in this ancient, forgotten cave. I turned toward it, hope igniting once more. The hum grew louder, accompanied by a faint glow that seeped through the cracks in the stone. "No," the woman hissed, her voice sharp and angry. "He's found it." Found what? I didn't wait to find out. I bolted toward the glow, my legs burning with effort. The tunnel twisted sharply, the walls seeming to press closer with each step. The hum grew louder, the light brighter, until I stumbled into another chamber, one unlike any I'd seen before. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and they pulsed faintly with a pale blue light. At the center of the room stood a massive, ancient-looking structure, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under the glowing light. The hum emanated from it, a low, resonant sound that filled the chamber. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I didn't care. It felt safe, protected. The family's footsteps faltered as they entered the chamber, their faces twisting in a mixture of fear and anger. The man took a step forward, but the light flared, forcing him back. "This changes nothing," he growled, his voice filled with venom. I stayed close to the glowing structure, my heart pounding as I watched them retreat to the edges of the room. Whatever this was, it was keeping them at bay, but I knew it wouldn't last. I needed to find a way out before the light faded, before they could reach me. The structure in the center of the chamber hummed louder, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. Each pulse sent a wave of warmth through the room, holding the family at bay, but also drawing my attention to the intricate carvings. They seemed almost alive, shifting and writhing as if they held some kind of secret. The woman's voice broke through the hum, sharp and cutting. "You don't know what you're playing with," she said, her tone a mixture of anger and fear. Her pale hand reached out toward the structure, but the light flared again, forcing her back with a hiss. I stepped closer to the structure, my fingers brushing against the carvings. They were warm to the touch, and as my hand lingered, a faint vibration traveled through my arm. Images flashed in my mind. Ancient cities, shadowy figures, and a blinding light that seemed to consume everything. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Whatever this was, it was far beyond my understanding. The man's face twisted with frustration. "It's not yours to take," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. The children's eyes glowed faintly in the pulsating light, their small hands clenching and unclenching as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. I scanned the chamber, searching for an exit. The light from the structure illuminated the walls, revealing another tunnel at the far end. It was narrow, barely wide enough to crawl through, but it was a way out. The hum of the structure grew louder, almost deafening, as if it were urging me to move. "You can't leave," the girl said, her voice sing-song and chilling. The glowing structure pulsed more violently now, as though sensing the growing tension. The carvings twisted and writhed faster under the light, and I could feel a strange energy coursing through the chamber. The hum reached a fever pitch, vibrating through the very rock beneath my feet. I had no choice but to act, and fast. The family stood at the edges of the room, their pale faces twisted in anger and fear. The man's voice cut through the noise, filled with venom and desperation. "Step away from it. You don't know what you're dealing with." Ignoring him, I placed both hands on the glowing structure. The warmth surged through me, almost overwhelming, as if the very life of the earth was pouring into my veins. The images that flashed in my mind were sharper now. Glimpses of ancient civilizations, forgotten rituals, and a blinding light tearing through darkness. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew this was my only chance. The woman lunged forward, her hand outstretched. "Stop him!" she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. The light flared brighter than ever, forcing her back with a pained hiss. The children wailed, their voices high and unnatural as they shielded their eyes from the searing glow. I could feel the structure pulling me in, merging with me. The carvings shifted beneath my touch, rearranging themselves into a pattern I couldn't comprehend but instinctively knew was significant. A low, guttural sound escaped the man as he made one last attempt to reach me, but the light lashed out, driving him back once more. "This ends now," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I was addressing them or the structure itself. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pressed into the carvings, willing them to activate, to do something, anything, that would end this nightmare. The light exploded outward in a blinding wave, consuming everything in its path. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and for a moment I thought I might be torn apart. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise ceased. The chamber fell silent. When I opened my eyes, the family was gone. The room was empty, save for the glowing structure, now dim and dormant. The carvings had stopped moving, frozen in place like an ancient relic. Weak and trembling, I stumbled toward the exit tunnel, illuminated by the faint remnants of the light. The way was clear now, the oppressive darkness lifted. Step by step, I climbed, each movement taking me closer to freedom. Finally, I emerged into the cool night air, the stars overhead like distant beacons of hope. Collapsing to the ground, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing with the impossibility of what I had just survived. I don't know what I unleashed down there, or if I truly ended it, but one thing is certain, I'll never set foot in a cave again. The dense woods were eerily quiet, broken only by the crunch of dried leaves beneath my boots. My flashlight beam danced across twisted tree trunks and gnarled roots, struggling to pierce the gloom. The entrance to the cave loomed ahead, a jagged maw in the limestone, its blackness impenetrable even to the faint twilight spilling through the trees. I hesitated, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence around me. For years, caving had been my escape, a way to dive into the earth's mysteries and leave the mundane world behind. But this cave was different. It wasn't mapped, wasn't in any guidebooks. It had no name, just whispered rumors of strange sounds and inexplicable happenings. Clutching my gear tighter, I stepped inside, the damp air clinging to my skin like a cold sweat. The light from the entrance faded quickly, leaving me with only the thin beam of my flashlight to navigate the jagged walls and uneven ground. The space grew narrower as I moved deeper, forcing me to crouch and squeeze through tight gaps. Something about the silence unsettled me. It wasn't the usual heavy quiet of underground chambers, but a silence that felt alive, like the cave itself was holding its breath. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. I paused, letting the light play over the rough walls. There was nothing unusual, just the same limestone formations and loose rocks I'd seen 100 times before. Then I noticed them. Footprints. They trailed across the dust-covered floor, leading to another passage. My heart skipped a beat. The prints weren't mine, and they looked fresh. I knelt to examine them, shining my flashlight closer. The tracks were strange, elongated as though whoever or whatever had left them wasn't wearing shoes. The thought sent a chill crawling up my spine, but curiosity overrode my fear. Following the trail, I entered the passage. It was narrower here, forcing me to move slowly, my breath echoing off the closed walls. As I rounded a bend, the air changed. A faint metallic scent filled my nostrils, sharp and unpleasant. My flashlight flickered. I stopped, smacking it against my palm until the beam steadied. Ahead, the passage widened into another chamber. This one was larger, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows. The footprints led to the center, where something gleamed faintly in the light. A chair. It was out of place in this environment, an ordinary wooden chair, weathered and cracked but otherwise intact. Its presence made no sense, and yet it was undeniably there, waiting in the middle of this forsaken cave. I approached cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the gravel floor. The chair bore deep scratches on its arms, as if someone had gripped it tightly, and the wood was stained dark in places, too dark for simple age. As I stood there, staring, the silence around me shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration in the air. Then I heard it. Footsteps. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the chamber, steady and deliberate. I froze, straining to pinpoint their origin. The tunnel behind me yawned with emptiness, the one ahead curling deeper into shadow. The sound didn't seem to belong to either. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing against the stone walls. It sounded small, swallowed by the cavernous space. No answer. My grip tightened around the flashlight as I scanned the chamber again, the beam catching on the scratched arms of the chair. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe, hopefully, another explorer, but something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. They weren't rushed or hesitant, but slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was making them wanted to be heard. "Is someone there?" I tried again. This time, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. My heart pounded as I backed away from the chair, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footprints on the dusty floor seemed to twist and scatter, leading in every direction and nowhere at once. Then, from the tunnel ahead came a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. A single word carried on a breath. Leave. Panic flared in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. My rational mind screamed that it was just my imagination, that the isolation and darkness were playing tricks on me. But the footprints, the chair, and that whisper painted a different picture. I considered turning back, but something stopped me. It wasn't bravery. It was the gnawing pull of curiosity. I had to know what was deeper in this cave, what was leaving these footprints, what was whispering from the shadows. Steeling myself, I pressed forward into the next tunnel, my steps cautious. The air grew colder as I moved, the metallic tang in my nostrils becoming stronger. My flashlight illuminated more tracks, their strange elongated shape etched into the dirt. The tunnel wound downward, the walls narrowing until I had to crouch to continue. Each step felt heavier, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted. My foot slid and I stumbled, catching myself against the rough wall. My flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam casting frantic, jittery arcs across the tunnel. I scrambled to pick it up, the darkness pressing in around me. That's when I noticed the smell, a putrid stench that hit me like a wave. It wasn't just metallic anymore. It was something far worse, something decayed. I swept the flashlight beam around, and my breath caught in my throat. Bones. They were scattered across the tunnel floor, some yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh. They lay in disarray as though they'd been dragged here and abandoned. A skull stared back at me, its hollow eye sockets a silent warning. The whisper returned, louder this time. Leave. This time it wasn't alone. There was movement, soft shuffling, and disturbingly close. The footsteps were back, echoing through the narrow tunnel, but I couldn't see their source. I spun, pointing my flashlight down the way I'd come. The beam cut through the darkness, but the tunnel was empty. Then the sound came again, closer now, from the direction I was heading. Cold fear prickled across my skin. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse raced as I pressed myself against the wall, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But then the whispers stopped. From the darkness ahead, 2 pinpricks of light emerged, faint and flickering. Eyes. They blinked once, and the footsteps began again, this time rushing toward me. I turned and ran. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled back up the sloping tunnel. The walls seemed to close in around me, the jagged rock catching at my jacket as I stumbled forward. Behind me, the footsteps quickened, closing the distance. The flashlight's beam wavered as I ran, casting distorted shadows on the tunnel walls. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent, an unholy chorus echoing through the cavern. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. Keep running. I tripped on an uneven patch of rock, sprawling to the ground. My flashlight skidded out of my hand, rolling a few feet ahead. Panic surged as I reached for it, my fingers closing around the handle just as the air behind me grew colder. I didn't dare look back. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted into the chamber with the chair. The sight of it, ordinary and unsettling, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I had no time to dwell on it. The footsteps followed me into the room, their rhythm echoing in the confined space. Desperation drove me toward the exit, but as I approached the tunnel leading back to the surface, a figure stepped into view. It was a shadow at first, a humanoid shape that seemed to form out of the darkness itself. The figure stood motionless, its elongated limbs barely distinguishable from the blackness around it. My flashlight beam flickered, catching its face, or what should have been a face. There was nothing. No eyes, no mouth, just a featureless void where a face should be. I froze, my chest tightening as the figure began to move. Its steps were slow but deliberate, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. Behind me, the footsteps and whispers grew louder. I was trapped. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, its movements unnaturally fluid, and pointed back toward the tunnel I'd just fled. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No way, I'm not going back there." The figure tilted its head further, almost mockingly, and stepped closer. The air felt heavier, suffocating. My flashlight sputtered again, the beam dimming as though the very darkness around me was consuming it. "Stay back!" I yelled, gripping a rock from the ground and hurling it toward the figure. The rock passed through it harmlessly, clattering against the wall behind. The whispers swelled to a deafening crescendo, and I realized with chilling clarity that the figure wasn't alone. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, each one as featureless and unsettling as the first. They moved with the same eerie precision, forming a circle around me. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam struggling to hold back the encroaching shadows. A cold, bone-deep dread rooted me in place. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't run. The whispers coalesced into a single chilling word, spoken in unison by the shadows. Join. I shook my head, backing away until my legs hit the chair. My knees buckled, and I collapsed into it. The moment I sat down, the shadows stopped. The silence was immediate and deafening, as if the cavern itself was holding its breath. The figures remained still, their faceless heads turned toward me. Then the chair began to move. It wasn't a natural motion. It slid across the ground as if pulled by an invisible force, dragging me deeper into the chamber. The shadows followed, their unblinking gazes fixed on me. Panic surged as I gripped the armrests, struggling to rise, but the chair held me in place. The air grew colder with every passing second, the metallic scent now overpowering. Ahead, a new tunnel opened, its blackness deeper than anything I'd ever seen. The chair stopped at the entrance, and for a moment all was still. Then from the tunnel's depths came the sound of footsteps, not human ones. The footsteps emerging from the tunnel were wrong. They echoed unevenly, like something crawling and walking at the same time. Each thud reverberated with an unnatural weight, rattling the chair beneath me. The shadows surrounding me began to shift, stepping back into the walls as if retreating. For the first time since I had entered the cave, I felt alone, and that terrified me even more. The chair jerked forward suddenly, dragged closer to the tunnel by the same unseen force. I gripped the armrests, my knuckles white as a wave of frigid air swept over me. My flashlight, clutched tightly in my lap, flickered faintly, its dying beam illuminating the edges of the tunnel. Something moved in the darkness. A shape, too large, too twisted to be human, emerged into the weak light. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, jointed in ways that defied nature. It crawled on all fours, its movements jerky and insect-like. And its face, oh God, its face. It had no eyes, only gaping holes that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of needle-like teeth that clicked together with every breath. A guttural, wet sound came from deep within its throat, somewhere between a growl and a laugh. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature paused at the tunnel's entrance, tilting its head as if savoring my terror. Then it began to crawl closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Stay back." The chair moved again, pulled further into the tunnel. I struggled against the invisible force, trying to free myself, but it was like being held by iron chains. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its head lowering to meet my gaze. It was so close now that I could smell it, a foul stench of rot and decay. It opened its mouth wider, the clicking of its teeth growing louder, and then it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts. Its voice echoed inside my head, cold and invasive. "You came uninvited. You saw what was hidden. Now you must stay." I shook my head violently, trying to block out the voice. "No, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The creature's head snapped to the side as if irritated by my protests. The chair moved again, sliding deeper into the tunnel's suffocating darkness. Desperation clawed at me. My hand brushed against the crucifix hanging around my neck, and I gripped it tightly. The cold metal was a lifeline, the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. I ripped it free from the chain and held it out, the small silver cross catching the last flickers of my flashlight. The creature recoiled, a guttural hiss escaping its throat. The chair jerked violently, spinning around as if trying to throw me off. Taking advantage of the moment, I leaped from the chair, stumbling to the ground. Pain shot through my knee, but I forced myself to stand, clutching the crucifix in front of me like a shield. The creature lunged, its gaping maw inches from my face. I thrust the crucifix forward, its silver edge grazing the creature's skin. A sizzle filled the air, and the beast let out a piercing shriek, its body writhing in agony. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs carried me forward, back into the chamber, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The whispers returned, but now they were panicked, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. The shadows reappeared, but they didn't block my path. They seemed to part, melting into the walls as I ran past. Behind me, the creature roared, its guttural cries echoing through the tunnels. I glanced back just once and saw it thrashing wildly, its movements erratic as it struggled to follow. The chair lay overturned, forgotten in the chaos. I didn't stop running. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every step. My flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, plunging me into total darkness. But ahead, faintly, I saw it, a sliver of light. The faint sliver of light ahead was my salvation. My lungs burned, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I pushed forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the cave itself was trying to pull me back into its depths. Behind me, the creature's guttural roars grew louder, accompanied by the relentless clicking of its teeth. It was coming, and it wasn't slowing down. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple, shifting and writhing as I stumbled past. Whispers filled the air, frantic and overlapping, their words indecipherable but urgent. It was as if the cave was alive, urging me to leave before it was too late. The sliver of light grew larger, resolving into the outline of the cave's entrance. The cool, fresh scent of the outside world reached me, a stark contrast to the stench of decay that clung to my skin. But the creature was closing in. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was faster now, its limbs a blur as it crawled after me with an unnatural speed. Its eyeless face twisted toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving within the dark voids of its sockets, something alive. Panic surged through me, and I tripped, crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the crucifix from my hand, and it skidded across the rocky floor, coming to rest just out of reach. No! I scrambled toward it, my fingers clawing at the dirt. The creature was almost upon me, its shadow swallowing the light from the entrance. The temperature plummeted, and I could feel its breath, a cold, wet gust that reeked of death on the back of my neck. I lunged for the crucifix, closing my hand around it just as the creature struck. Its clawed hand slashed at me, catching my shoulder and sending me sprawling. Pain seared through my body, but I refused to let go of the cross. With a desperate cry, I turned and thrust the crucifix toward the creature. The silver glinted faintly in the dim light, and the reaction was immediate. The creature recoiled, its shriek so loud and piercing that it felt like my skull might split. The sound reverberated through the cavern, shaking the walls and dislodging chunks of rock. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized with dawning horror that the cave was collapsing. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle protesting, and bolted for the entrance. Rocks tumbled around me, some grazing my arms and legs, but I didn't stop. The light was just ahead, so close I could almost taste freedom. With one final leap, I threw myself out of the cave and into the open air. I landed hard, the rough forest floor scraping my palms and knees. Behind me, the cave entrance groaned, a deep, mournful sound before the rocks gave way entirely, sealing the darkness inside. Silence fell. I lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, the cold night air stinging my lungs. The forest around me was quiet again, the stillness almost unnatural after the chaos I'd just escaped. But I wasn't safe. I pushed myself to my knees, clutching the crucifix tightly as I stared at the now sealed entrance. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something pale and distorted just beyond the cracks in the rock. Then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not from inside the cave, but behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was dark, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows under the pale moonlight, and there, standing among the trees, was a figure. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I knew. I could feel it watching me, its presence as oppressive as the darkness in the cave. The whispers began again, carried on the wind. I didn't wait to hear more. Clutching the crucifix, I ran into the night, leaving the cave, and whatever was waiting for me, behind. But even now, as I sit in the safety of my home, I can't escape the feeling that I'm still being followed. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it again. Footsteps. I rented the same lake house where we vacationed 13 years ago. That was the last summer for the four of us. The seamstress before the kids started drifting away from Stephen and me. The summer of our last real togetherness. We used to find lake glass on those vacations, fragments of broken bottles and weathered debris transformed by a mythical water nymph, the lake glass woman, who turned trash into treasures. The stories were far more romantic than the truth. Discarded beer bottles and litter smoothed by time and waves. We loved pretending they were water nymphs' tears. That folklore helped create our happiest memories. At home, I had a jar of rare blues, greens, and one extraordinary amber shard, displayed like a shrine on my nightstand. Maybe the kids would want it someday, later. But I had become irrelevant. My children had grown beyond needing me, and I had grown tired of my hollow marriage. My career was just a job, never a calling. Life had been drained of meaning until one night this past spring when I found myself gazing at the glimmering pieces of glass nestled in the jar beside my bed. It hit me then. I finally knew how to fill the emptiness inside me. I told Stephen I needed time away, a solo trip in the fall after we dropped our youngest off at her new apartment. He barely looked up from his phone when he agreed. We had become nothing more than roommates managing logistics. Now, I walk along the lake's edge, feeling the wet sand squish beneath my bare feet. The crisp autumn air bites at my skin. This trip would be my last. Tomorrow, I'd rise early, pour myself a stiff drink, and walk into the lake's icy embrace, letting its cold waters carry me away. Whiskey warms me as I wander hazily from the cabin to the shoreline. The sunset paints the sky in golds and deep purples, its reflection rippling across the glassy water. I take a deep breath and step forward. But something stirs in the lake. A figure rises from the water, feminine, with curves sculpted from glistening shards of lake glass. Her translucent form catches the fading light, a kaleidoscope of blues and greens shimmering as she moves. She strides purposefully toward me, each step deliberate and graceful. I stumble back, the cold sand catching me as I fall. My breath hitches as she looms over me, her violet eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. The lake glass woman crouches and plucks a rusted bottle cap from the ground beside me. She places it between her opalescent lips, her iridescent skin catching the last rays of sunlight. When she removes the cap from her mouth, it has been transformed into a smooth, radiant gem, a brilliant emerald stone. She extends it to me with a serene smile. I take the gem, my hand trembling. The woman tilts her head, her gaze piercing yet kind. Without a word, she turns and walks back into the lake, vanishing beneath the darkening waves. I sit there, stunned, as the stars begin to shimmer above. The gem in my palm feels warm against my skin, a reminder of something I cannot yet name. As the lake swallows the last of the sunset, I take a deep breath of cool, crisp air. My heart feels full for the first time in years. Clutching the emerald gem, I stand and begin the walk back to the cabin. I am not done with this world yet. There is more for me to reclaim. Sometimes the toads would just sit out on the lawn, a choreographed semicircle of horror, reverberating their growl groans around our white clapboard house in a way that tickled my spine. If I had enough courage, I'd shine our biggest flashlight out into their direction, daring myself to see their unblinking eyes reflected back at me. I became fixated on the cane toads at the same time my grandfather got sick. They provided a strange, almost grotesque distraction from the sadness that seeped under every door and drifted through the suffocating summer air that clung to every wall of our home. The other distraction was my neighbor, Caleb. He was older than me and seemed to know more about everything. Often we talked about the toads. He said there were plenty of ways to kill them. You could sprinkle salt on them and they'd slowly shrivel. You could smash them with a golf club or a baseball bat. But the most humane way, Caleb told me, was to catch them in a plastic bag and put them in the freezer. I thought about our freezer. It was small, crammed with chicken tenders and cherry popsicles, which my mom always kept stocked during the blistering heat of summer. Since my grandfather got sick, my mom started buying them every week. She'd wink at me after dinner each night, her unspoken cue for me to grab one. Most nights after dinner, I sat with Caleb on the porch, armed with our flashlights, sometimes talking, often in silence. "How's your granddad?" "Not good." A low grunt came from the bushes. I shone the flashlight, but nothing moved. "Where do you think they even came from?" "What?" "The toads." "I don't know." "The woods?" I thought about the question a lot when I couldn't sleep. Why were those gnarled, grotesque creatures even here? Different people had different explanations. My mom, a biologist, told me that settlers brought sugar cane, which attracted cane beetles. To control the beetles, they brought the cane toads, but things quickly spiraled out of control. "And what's going to come to eat the cane toads?" I asked her one night. She sighed, shaking her head. "Go eat your popsicle, sweetheart." My grandfather wasn't a scientist. One sunny afternoon, as he sat on the porch sipping tea, I asked him the same question. He chuckled softly and told me the story of Pandora's box, how temptation led to opening it, unleashing all the world's suffering and pestilence. "The cane toads must have been in there too," he joked, smiling faintly. That evening, I relayed his story to Caleb. He didn't seem impressed. "Time to practice getting rid of them. Go on." He handed me a plastic bag. I stared at it for a long moment before inching toward the croaks, his flashlight illuminating the patchy grass just enough. Gathering my courage, I lunged and caught one, enveloping its leathery, writhing body in the bag. I was surprised by how sluggish it was. Twisting the bag tight, I carried it back to Caleb, the toad thrashing with unnerving strength. "What now?" "Just hit it on something to knock it out first." I hesitated before lightly tapping the bag against the ground. It didn't slow down much. Heart pounding, I rushed inside and shoved the bag into the freezer, slamming the door shut. Then I went to bed, my mind racing with questions. Where had they come from? Why were they here? Through the night, I could hear my grandfather coughing, the click of lights switching on and off, and in my half-sleep, the distant wail of an ambulance siren. In the morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter from my mom. She'd taken my grandfather to the hospital. I sat with Caleb on the porch for most of the day, neither of us saying much. By evening, they still hadn't come home. In moments like that, I craved comfort, a cherry popsicle. The thought of it tugged at me until I finally gave in. Sweat dripping down my back, I walked into the kitchen, stood before the freezer, and wrapped my hand around the handle. With a deep breath, I opened the door. There, poised sloppily on the frosty wrapper of my popsicles, sat the toad. Its unblinking eyes stared back at me, its toes curled awkwardly like the color of mud. My heart stopped as its eyelids slowly closed and opened again. I slammed the freezer shut. Outside, in the bushes, the unseen toads grunted in unison, their calls echoing through the humid evening air like a chorus of triumph. Cuck-088 said to close the lid on little Daisy. It felt a bit odd, but everyone clapped and I went for it. When Daisy first sniffed her new suitcase-turned cushioned bed, her tail wagged left, right, a pendulum on meth. My lifeline, she deserved this treat. Literally, she's the only one who hadn't left my side through my skint days. See, bald prick Mike had no respect for my being on the socials. Too old to get what it takes. He and his pathetic not on the job lad and don't bother coming in. Keep your fake client-facing smiles and minimum wage, Mike. Look who's trending now. Monetizing too. Yeah, I hesitated, but the wisdom of the masses, that's magic. Mum always went to church. Me, I live stream Pack Daisy on Sundays when the clock hits midnight. But you've subscribed, so you know that already. Daisy's been a real sport about it. Must be that bit of Corgi blood in her. What with the suitcases getting smaller and smaller. My mates online came up with that idea. I worried at first. Obviously, I wouldn't want to hurt her. But when I looked at the numbers, holy F-U, skake. And I try to make it snugly for her in there. Like when Samsonite reached out, I made them line the insides of the trolley with pink velvet and that bakery box complete with luxury dog biscuits. Still, we've had a few bumps, like the time she weed all over that All Saints vintage leather bag when the zipper zipped, or that IKEA plastic container, shoebox sized, bit cramped. I didn't love that, but this is about something bigger than just me and her. She's a brave soul, Daisy, loyal. She knows how important this is, and when she gets bitey, I tell her, love ya, but we can't have a little mutt running a big show, can we? My people voted for a lockbox. You put the thing in, set the time limit, and it shuts. We did 30 seconds for starters, and people went wild watching the countdown. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Slow and steady wins the bloody race. I turned the radio up, louder than the barking, and just watched the dollars pour in. Hear that, Mike? You backwards twat. Master 7 Fee 5 had a custom lockbox delivered, see-through, pet casket shaped, 20 minutes in minimum. Sent a taser too, just in case. Daisy pointed her ears when I unboxed it, then started clawing at the corner of the room. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. She's pure gold, practically a GIF. I made all that into a teaser, uploaded it, and smashed the platform. Yes, your name will be up there on the wall too next time we air. The final drop, but me and you were just getting started. Thanks for your support. Here, Daisy, Daisy, Daisy. Have a little go? Feeling feisty, are we? Come now, it'll be so much better if you go unconscious. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. Just a little taste then? Right, in you go. That's a pup. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as I drove along the old highway. This stretch of road had always been quiet, almost forgotten, with tall trees flanking either side, their branches arching overhead like a natural cathedral. The silence was comforting at first, but as the light faded and darkness crept in, the solitude began to feel oppressive. I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the stillness. I was tired and longing for the familiar warmth of home, but there was still a long way to go. The road stretched endlessly before me, winding through the desolate countryside. As night fully descended, I noticed a figure standing by the roadside in the distance. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure was barely illuminated by my headlights, a shadowy silhouette against the dark backdrop of the woods. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a man. He stood there, one arm raised in a tentative wave, the other clutching a small duffel bag. His face, illuminated briefly by my passing headlights, looked tired and drawn. Something about him caught my attention. He wasn't just looking for a ride. He seemed lost, as though he had nowhere else to go. I hesitated, my instincts battling with my sense of compassion. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I usually did, especially not on a lonely road at night. But there was something in his demeanor, his quiet, almost resigned posture that made me pull over. Rolling down the window, I called out, "Where are you headed?" He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Just a few miles down the road," he said, his voice low and steady. "If it's not too much trouble." I glanced at him, taking in his worn jacket and weathered face. He didn't seem threatening, just tired and out of place somehow. "All right," I said, unlocking the door. "Hop in." "Thank you," he said sincerely, climbing into the passenger seat and placing his bag at his feet. As I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't help but steal glances at him. He sat quietly, staring out the window, his hands resting on his knees. There was a strange calmness about him, but it was tinged with something else. Sadness, maybe? "So, where are you coming from?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the dark trees rushing past. "Been wandering for a while," he said after a pause. "Trying to get back home." "Where's home?" "Red Hollow," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's a little town a few miles from here. You've probably never heard of it." "I've heard of it," I said. "Never been there, though. What brings you back?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's been a long time," he said softly. "There are people I need to see, things I need to make right." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to ask more, but sensed it wasn't the right time. Instead, I focused on the road, the silence between us broken only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt. After a while, he spoke again. "I used to walk these roads as a kid," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Back then, this place felt alive. People knew each other. Now it's all faded away like it never existed." "Things change," I said. "Sometimes for the better, sometimes not." He nodded, his expression distant. "Yeah," he murmured. "But some things, they shouldn't change." We drove on, the conversation ebbing and flowing like a tide. He told me about his childhood, about the small-town life he had left behind. He spoke of his family, his mother who used to bake the best apple pies, his father who taught him how to fish in the nearby creek. His words painted a vivid picture, and for a moment I could almost see it, a life simpler and fuller than the one I knew. "Why did you leave?" I asked eventually. His face grew somber. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "Hurt people I didn't mean to. Sometimes you don't realize what you've lost until it's too late." We fell silent again, the weight of his words settling between us. About 20 minutes later, he pointed to a small dirt road branching off the highway. "Turn here," he said. I did as he instructed, the car bumping along the uneven path. The woods grew denser, the trees closing in around us. Finally, we emerged into a clearing, and there it was. A house. It stood like a relic from another time, its wooden frame weathered and sagging. Ivy crawled up its walls, and the windows were dark and lifeless. It looked abandoned, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. I parked the car and turned to him. "Are you sure?" I asked, glancing at the dilapidated structure. He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm home now," he said. He opened the door, grabbed his duffel bag, and stepped out. I watched as he walked up the creaking steps and entered the house. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Something didn't feel right. The house looked uninhabitable, and the eerie stillness around it sent shivers down my spine. After a few moments, I decided to check on him. I climbed the steps and knocked on the door. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, and the interior was covered in dust and cobwebs. It was clear no one had lived here for years. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no sign of him. Then I saw it, a framed photograph on the mantel. I picked it up and froze. It was him, standing in front of the house with a woman and a young child. The photo was dated 1987. My blood ran cold as I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a wave. The man I had given a ride to couldn't have been real. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a deep sense of unease. I ran back to my car and drove away as fast as I could. The image of that photograph burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. Was he a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely? All I know is that I brought him home, wherever or whenever that may be. It was late spring, and the days had started stretching longer, though the evenings still carried a chill that hinted at winter's lingering presence. I had taken a weekend off to escape the monotony of city life and decided to visit my grandparents' village, a small, picturesque settlement surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests with a river meandering lazily through its heart. The river had always been a favorite spot of mine. As a child, I would spend hours there, skipping stones across the water or sitting by its banks, listening to the gurgling stream and the symphony of birds in the trees. It had an almost magical quality, a place where time seemed to slow down. On my second evening in the village, just before sunset, I decided to take a walk to the river. The path leading there was lined with wildflowers, their colors vivid in the golden light. The air was fresh and carried the faint scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. As I walked, memories of my childhood visits flooded back, filling me with a sense of nostalgia. When I reached the riverbank, I noticed someone standing a little further downstream. He was a man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a simple white shirt and trousers. He stood motionless, staring out at the water, his hands clasped behind his back. There was something oddly serene about his posture, yet it felt out of place, like he was a part of the scene but didn't belong there. Curious, I approached him slowly, the gravel crunching softly under my feet. As I drew closer, I called out, "Good evening. Beautiful spot, isn't it?" The man turned his head toward me. His face was pale, almost translucent in the fading light, and his eyes held a deep, almost haunting sadness. "Indeed," he said, his voice low and measured, "this river holds many memories." I stopped a few feet away, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. "Do you come here often?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. He nodded, his gaze returning to the water. "I used to, many years ago. This was my favorite place." His words carried a weight I couldn't quite place, as though they were laced with an unspoken story. "Are you visiting the village?" I asked. He smiled faintly, a hint of sorrow in the curve of his lips. "Something like that." We stood there in silence for a while, watching the river flow. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and purple. The air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. "Do you have family here?" I asked, hoping to learn more about him. He hesitated before answering. "I did, a long time ago." I frowned, sensing the vagueness in his response. "Are you all right?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. He turned to look at me fully now, and for a moment I thought I saw something shift in his expression, something otherworldly. "I'm fine," though his voice held a note of finality. "But tell me, why are you here?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm visiting my grandparents," I explained. "I used to come here as a child. This river, it's special to me." He nodded thoughtfully, as though my words carried some deeper meaning. "The river has a way of holding on to people," he said softly. "Their hopes, their sorrows, their secrets." I didn't know how to respond to that. There was something about his presence that felt both comforting and unsettling, like an old melody you couldn't quite place. After a few more moments of silence, he spoke again. "It's getting late. You should head back." I glanced at the darkening sky, realizing he was right. "What about you?" I asked. "Are you staying here?" He smiled faintly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." There was something final in his tone, and I didn't press further. I gave him a small nod and turned to leave. As I walked back up the path, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. He was still there, standing by the river, his figure bathed in the faint glow of twilight. When I returned to the village, I mentioned the encounter to my grandfather. "I saw a man by the river," I said. "He seemed different. Do you know who he might be?" My grandfather's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and he set down his cup of tea. "What did he look like?" he asked, his voice low. I described the man, the white shirt, the quiet demeanor, the sadness in his eyes. My grandfather leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed by the dim light of the room. "That sounds like Ravi," he said finally. "Ravi?" I asked, confused. "He used to live here decades ago," my grandfather explained. "He loved that river. Spent every evening there, just like you described. But one day, he drowned. They say he slipped on the rocks and hit his head. His body was found downstream near the old bridge. A chill ran down my spine. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I just saw him." My grandfather's gaze was steady, his voice grave. "Some say his spirit never left. He returns to the river, waiting for something or someone." I sat there, stunned, the weight of the encounter sinking in. Had I really spoken to a ghost? The thought seemed absurd, yet the memory of his presence, his voice, his sadness, was vivid and real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man by the river, his cryptic words and the sorrow in his eyes. Who was he waiting for? And why had he chosen to speak to me? I would never know the answers, but one thing was certain. I would never look at the river the same way again. Willowshade is a cursed little village nestled in the misty countryside of Maine, 80 miles north of Portland, near the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Its 4,600 residents live in colonial-era homes that form a crooked ring around a 17th century chapel, as well as in old trailers perched along windswept cliffs. Willowshade's exact origins remain mysterious, and its history is soaked in eerie tales of floods, invasions, and monsters, both mythical and real. Every corner of its sordid past seems touched by the supernatural. The village takes its name from a local legend about a young woman, Lydia Willowshade, the daughter of a Puritan minister. According to the story, Lydia was executed during a witch trial in 1692, but was said to have risen from her grave to curse those who condemned her. In 1765, the town was devastated by a fiery storm that some claimed was caused by a malevolent sea spirit. And in 1837, a lynch mob targeted a family accused of harboring dark secrets, leaving behind a legacy of whispers and shadows. Fast forward to 2005, when 30-year-old sales executive Vanessa Campbell returned to Willowshade to view a house for sale. Number 13 Cedar Lane, also known as the Keep, had a dark past. Once a colonial jail, it had held women accused of witchcraft, including the infamous Agnes Blackwood, who was hanged for allegedly cursing the townsfolk. "I remembered seeing the old sign outside," Campbell explained in a recent interview. "I didn't feel scared. I grew up around this stuff." Vanessa, with her jet black hair and adventurous spirit, wasn't interested in the bland cookie-cutter apartments most people her age gravitated toward. She wanted something unique, something with a story. The Keep was just that. Though converted into a home in the early 1900s, the building still bore the marks of its grim history. Barred windows, thick stone walls, and iron rings bolted into the basement floor where prisoners had once been shackled. The property had been on the market for months, largely due to its reputation. Rumors abounded, tenants breaking leases, neighbors reporting unexplainable screams at night, and even a recent suicide by one of the previous owners. But to Vanessa, the $150,000 asking price seemed a bargain. "I could picture myself living there, fixing it up, maybe even settling down eventually," she said. Having spent over a decade working in sales for luxury vacation properties, Vanessa had cultivated a sharp independence, yet her travels had insulated her from the folklore of her hometown. She was vaguely aware that the narrow alley behind the house was known as Coffin Row, so named for the bodies carried through it during the town's darkest days. She had also heard whispers about a skeleton unearthed near the old chapel, its limbs bound with iron to prevent it from returning to life. Still, these stories felt like quaint local trivia, not red flags. "I grew up in an old house too," Vanessa explained. "There were always weird noises. It never bothered me." She also admitted she knew little about Agnes Blackwood and the witch trials. To her, the Keep's ominous reputation was part of its charm. But soon after moving in, she began to regret her decision. What started as small, almost dismissible occurrences, books sliding off shelves, strange cold drafts, soon escalated into a full-blown nightmare. Vanessa claimed that objects would fly across the room with alarming force, and she began waking up with unexplained bruises and bite marks. Visitors reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the house, and one guest even claimed to have been shoved down the staircase. Within months, Willowshade Keep had become infamous, with paranormal investigators, journalists, and even local clergy trying to make sense of the malevolent presence. John Fraser, a prominent researcher, compared it to the notorious Amityville Horror House in Long Island. "This is not just a haunted house," Fraser stated. "It's a vortex of something far darker." Unbeknownst to Vanessa, her dream home was becoming a waking nightmare, one she would soon realize had no easy escape. The shadows at 32 Elmwood Lane stood silent, cloaked in history and secrets. Ava Henderson couldn't wait to move in. On a brisk autumn afternoon in 2005, she and her best friend, Carla Monroe, lugged boxes up the groaning wooden stairs of their new home. The two had grown up in the coastal village of Graywick, Massachusetts, and couldn't have been more different. Ava was bold and headstrong, while Carla, recovering from a grueling battle with leukemia, was lighthearted and easygoing, a natural foil to Ava's intensity. Carla, who worked part-time at a nearby cafe, had heard all the chilling rumors about the shadows. "I remember this one family who lived here," Carla said as she dropped a box on the dusty floor. "Their son swore the house made him do things. He even set his room on fire more than once. People said he was possessed." Ava chuckled nervously, dismissing the stories as exaggerated village gossip. She set about unpacking, plugging in the kettle for a much-needed cup of tea. The shadows retained a rustic charm, its dark wooden beams crisscrossing the walls, whispering of its bygone days. While Carla carried another box inside, Ava was startled by the sound of footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she expected to see her friend, but instead she saw an ominous black mist lingering near the doorway. It dissipated before her eyes, leaving her frozen, her pulse racing. From the kitchen window, Ava watched Carla laughing outside as she struggled to carry a particularly heavy box. Ava swallowed her fear, determined not to alarm her friend. Later, Ava gave Carla a tour of the house. Downstairs, the remnants of its sinister past were unmistakable. A solid wooden door with iron bars, a chilling relic from its days as a colonial holding cell. In the soot-blackened fireplace, Ava discovered an ancient iron hook chained to the wall, a remnant of its days as a jail for criminals awaiting trial. As they cleaned, Ava stumbled upon a stack of yellowed papers in a forgotten corner of the kitchen. Among them was an unsettling discovery: a death certificate. "Oh my God," Ava muttered. "Look at this." Carla leaned over her shoulder to read the document. "This guy, George Hale, hung himself here," Ava said, her voice hushed. "And look at the date, October 27th, just days before Halloween." Carla grimaced. "Great. Just the vibe we need." Their cleaning unearthed more than just paperwork. Underneath an old rug, Ava found a squirming mass of maggots. She screamed, and Carla rushed over. Armed with bleach and determination, the pair scrubbed the floor clean, though the incident left them both unnerved. Other peculiarities quickly made themselves known. The house was perpetually cold, even on mild days. Odd drafts carried the scent of fresh-baked bread, acrid pipe smoke, and something sour that turned Ava's stomach. One morning, shortly after settling in, 3 loud knocks shattered the stillness of the house. When Ava opened the door, a boy stood on the porch. He couldn't have been older than 12, his hair spiked in messy tufts, his school uniform slightly askew. "I'm sorry to bother you," the boy stammered, "but it's tradition, you know?" "Excuse me?" Ava asked, confused. "My grandma, she's a white witch, says you have to knock 3 times when you pass this house. It's to show respect and keep the bad spirits away." He looked genuinely frightened. "Sorry again, I won't bother you." Without waiting for a reply, the boy bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows of the narrow alleyway. Though odd, Ava found herself charmed by Graywick. Through her bedroom window, she often spotted deer grazing in the nearby meadow. Nights in the village were eerily still, with only the occasional flicker of candlelight breaking the blackness. But Ava's fascination couldn't erase the house's dark history. The shadows had endured centuries of strife, and its walls seemed to hum with restless energy. Carla brushed it off, chalking everything up to overactive imaginations. But Ava couldn't shake the unease that prickled her skin whenever she passed the staircase or lingered in the kitchen. On one particularly quiet evening, Ava found herself flipping through an old book she had uncovered during their cleaning spree. It detailed the history of the area, including a woman named Marjorie Kemp, a midwife from the late 1600s accused of witchcraft. She had lived and died in Greywick, her reputation tarnished by whispers of curses and dark rituals. Ava's finger hovered over a passage. Marjorie Kemp was accused of placing curses that brought harm to her neighbors. Her accusers claimed she spoke incantations to heal, but her cures often came at a price. The uneasy connection between Marjorie Kemp and the shadows felt like a thread pulling tighter, binding Ava to a past she didn't fully understand. She snapped the book shut, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. If the rumors were true, the Shadows was more than just a house. It was a crossroads, a place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural converged. The vicar's visit to the cage was intended to bring peace to Vanessa Mitchell and Nicole Kirtley. Reverend Martin Flowerdew arrived on a brisk November morning, his demeanor calm yet curious. He carried a small wooden cross and a leather-bound prayer book. As he stepped inside, his expression changed subtly, as though the air in the cage bore a weight invisible to the naked eye. "This place has a history," he said softly, glancing at the wooden beams and the ominous cage door. Flowerdew began to pray, moving from room to room. He sprinkled holy water, pausing in places where he claimed to feel an oppressive energy. But the atmosphere didn't improve. That night, after Flowerdew's visit, Mitchell and Kirtley both awoke to the sound of heavy breathing in their respective rooms. Mitchell, never one to back down from a confrontation, shouted, "Who's there?" No response, just the slow, deliberate sound of something exhaling in the darkness. The strange occurrences escalated. One evening, while Freddie Young was visiting, he stopped mid-conversation, his face draining of color. "What's wrong?" Mitchell asked. Freddie pointed toward the fireplace, his voice barely a whisper. "There's someone standing there." Mitchell spun around but saw nothing. Kirtley, however, swore she caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure retreating into the corner. The boy, shaken, refused to stay any longer and ran home to his grandmother. Desperate for answers, Mitchell decided to dig deeper into the cage's history. She spent hours poring over old records at the local library and speaking with villagers who had their own chilling tales about the house. One elderly woman recounted a story about a tenant in the 1970s who had fled in the middle of the night after seeing a woman in black sitting at the foot of his bed. "I've lived in this village my whole life," the woman said, "and no one stays in that house for long. You do well to leave it." But leaving wasn't an option. Mitchell had sunk her savings into the property, and Kirtley, recovering from cancer, had nowhere else to go. As winter set in, the disturbances became physical. One night, while washing dishes, Mitchell felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Kirtley, too, began to experience unexplained bruises on her arms and legs, as though someone had grabbed her in her sleep. "I can't take this anymore," Kirtley sobbed one evening. "This house, it's alive. It doesn't want us here." Mitchell tried to reassure her friend, but deep down she was terrified. She began sleeping with the lights on, but even that provided little comfort. Then came the night that broke her resolve. Around 3 a.m., Mitchell was jolted awake by a loud bang. She rushed downstairs to find the kitchen in disarray. Plates and glasses were shattered on the floor, and the chain by the fireplace swung violently as if an unseen force were yanking it. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and chilling, whispering her name. "Vanessa." She froze, her heart pounding. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Vanessa." Grabbing her phone, she called Kirtley, who was upstairs. "Nicole, are you okay? Did you hear that?" But there was no answer. Panicking, Mitchell raced upstairs, only to find Kirtley huddled in a corner of her room, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's her," Kirtley whispered. "The witch. She's here." The two women fled the house that night, seeking refuge at the King's Arms. As they sat in the dim-lit pub, surrounded by the comforting hum of locals, Mitchell made a decision. "We have to find out what she wants," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This isn't just a haunting. It's a warning, and if we don't figure it out, it's going to destroy us." With the help of Freddie's grandmother, a local historian, and a paranormal investigator from Essex, Mitchell and Kirtley embarked on a quest to uncover the cage's darkest secrets. But the deeper they delved, the more they realized that the cage wasn't just haunted by the spirits of its tragic past. It was a portal, and something far more sinister was trying to break through. Vanessa Mitchell's departure from the cage did not mark the end of its haunting legacy. In fact, her leaving seemed to intensify the house's sinister grip on those who dared cross its threshold. Determined to turn her misfortune into an opportunity, Mitchell attempted to rent the cage to a friend from the village. However, her plans unraveled almost immediately. The prospective tenant, wary of the cage's dark reputation, hired a psychic to cleanse the property before moving in. The psychic, upon entering the courtyard, abruptly refused to proceed, her face pale with unease. "There is something here that does not want to leave," she murmured before hastily retreating. That friend backed out of the arrangement. Mitchell's next tenants, a young couple with an infant, managed to endure only 2 months before fleeing without explanation. The revolving door of renters continued, with no one lasting long enough to establish even a semblance of normalcy. Desperate for help, Mitchell reached out to the local church, only to discover that the vicar, Reverend Flowerdew, had abruptly transferred to a parish over 200 miles away. The official reason was stress, though rumors swirled about an incident involving a block of concrete smashing through his car windshield. In a candid interview with a local newspaper, Flowerdew admitted to suffering a nervous breakdown, an event he attributed to the relentless pressure of something unseen but oppressive lingering in St. Osyth. As financial pressures mounted, Mitchell decided to confront the cage's infamous reputation head-on. In 2010, she contacted the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, a venerable organization dedicated to investigating paranormal phenomena. John Fraser, a leading member of SPR's Spontaneous Cases Committee, visited the cage and conducted an extensive series of interviews with Mitchell, her friends, and former residents. Fraser found the testimonies compelling, drawing parallels between the cage and notorious poltergeist cases like Amityville, with one key difference. The cage stands out because the accounts come from multiple credible witnesses, Fraser noted. Among them were professionals like Liz Williams, a cancer nurse, and Claire Young, now a school teacher, whose calm demeanor lent weight to their unsettling recollections. Fraser's investigations also revealed disturbing physical effects experienced by visitors. A female investigator reported angry red marks appearing on her legs after an overnight vigil, which were later diagnosed as burn-like blisters by a medical professional. Kim Sondergaard, a Danish paranormal researcher, described being overcome by an intense wave of sadness while standing in the courtyard. "I broke down and cried uncontrollably," he recounted in a recorded testimony, adding that he left with unexplained bruises on his arms. The cage's reputation soon attracted amateur ghost hunters from across England. Equipped with Ouija boards, spirit boxes, and night vision cameras, they descended on the property, eager to document the supernatural. Sensing a commercial opportunity, Mitchell began renting the cage for ghost hunts, charging visitors £35 per night. The British tabloids quickly took notice, dubbing it Britain's most haunted house. Sensational headlines followed. One article claimed a retired police officer had photographed spectral figures in Coffin Alley, while another featured images of witch-like faces and a supposed satanic goat. Yet not everyone was convinced. Documentary filmmaker Colin Werland dismissed the supernatural claims as exaggerated. "She's made quite a bit of money out of this," he remarked skeptically. "It's hard to separate fact from fiction." Werland's doubts deepened after consulting archaeologist Jacqueline McKinley, who examined the supposed skeleton of Ursula Kemp, unearthed years earlier in St. Osyth. McKinley's findings were unequivocal. The remains were not of a female witch, but of a man, and the iron spikes accompanying the bones were recent embellishments intended to fuel the legend. Further revelations came from Paul Brooker, the grandson of Charles Brooker, who had initially discovered the skeleton. In a candid confession to the Clacton and Frinton Gazette, Paul admitted, "Granddad added the nails to make it more dramatic." In 2012, the bones were reburied in unconsecrated ground during a solemn ceremony attended by both pagan and Christian representatives. Despite this symbolic gesture, the cage's dark aura persisted. Unexplained phenomena continued to plague the property. The King's Arms pub, a local gathering spot, saw its regular patrons dwindle to none, leading to its eventual closure. Then, in 2016, an inexplicable car accident on Colchester Road brought the cage back into the spotlight. The driver of a BMW swerved off course, crashing directly into the building. Shaken but unharmed, he claimed to have no recollection of what caused him to lose control. To Mitchell, it was yet another sign that the cage's malevolence extended beyond its walls. By the end of the decade, Mitchell's financial woes forced her to sell the property. She listed it with a realtor who leaned into the house's infamous history, staging it with broomsticks and books about witchcraft. In January 2020, she finally accepted an offer of £224,000. Though the sale brought some relief, Mitchell's profits were eroded by years of mounting debts, legal fees, and property taxes. The new owner, a divorcee hoping for a fresh start, brushed aside Mitchell's warnings about the cage's cursed history. "She doesn't believe in ghosts at all," Mitchell remarked, a note of both pity and relief in her voice. For her, the sale marked the end of an ordeal that had defined more than a decade of her life, though she doubted the cage's restless spirits would ever truly be at peace. Vanessa Mitchell had finally made up her mind. She could no longer endure the torment of the cage. Every moment spent in the haunted house was a test of her sanity and survival. By summer 2008, she had resolved to leave for good, but the spirits within the cage seemed unwilling to let her go so easily. On her last night in the cage, Vanessa returned to the empty house to gather the final boxes of her belongings. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than ever, as though the house itself resented her departure. The old beams creaked under the weight of an unnatural stillness, and the faint scent of burnt wood wafted through the air, a cruel reminder of the fire that had once consumed the home of Charles Brooker, the man who had profited from the skeleton's grim legacy. As Vanessa stepped into the prison room, she was overcome by an oppressive chill. The dim light from her torch danced on the stone walls, casting eerie shadows. She hurriedly packed the last few items into a box, her every movement punctuated by the feeling of unseen eyes boring into her. Suddenly, the room darkened further, as though a heavy shadow had passed over her. "Leave," a deep voice whispered behind her. Vanessa froze, too terrified to turn around. The whisper grew louder, now a chorus of voices overlapping, all commanding the same thing: "Leave." Her pulse racing, Vanessa grabbed the box and bolted from the room. She didn't stop until she was outside, the box clutched tightly in her trembling arms. But as she loaded the box into the van, she glanced back at the cage and saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a woman dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, her hollow eyes fixed on Vanessa with a look of unrelenting malice. The move to her friend's house brought no immediate relief. Vanessa found herself haunted not by the spirits of the cage, but by vivid nightmares and a lingering sense of dread. On one particularly stormy night, she awoke to a violent pounding on the bedroom door. For a moment, she thought she was back in the cage. But when she opened the door, there was no one there, only the sound of wind howling through the trees outside. Determined to rid herself of the cage's grip, Vanessa sought help from local mediums and paranormal investigators. One medium, an elderly woman named Agnes, visited the house and confirmed Vanessa's worst fears. "This place is a portal," Agnes declared after walking through the cage. "The spirits here are restless because they were never given peace. You're lucky to have left when you did." Agnes advised Vanessa to hold a cleansing ritual to sever her connection to the house. Desperate for closure, Vanessa followed the instructions, burning sage and reciting prayers late into the night. Though the ritual brought her a measure of comfort, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of the cage would always be a part of her. Months later, Vanessa returned to the cage one last time, this time with a television crew for a paranormal documentary. She hoped that by sharing her story, she might finally achieve some closure. As the crew set up their equipment, strange phenomena began almost immediately. Cameras malfunctioned, lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. During an interview in the prison room, Vanessa recounted her most terrifying experiences. As she spoke, the camera operator suddenly gasped and pointed to the corner of the room. Everyone turned to see a dark shadow moving along the wall, only to vanish a moment later. The crew hurried to pack up their gear, unwilling to linger any longer than necessary. Years later, Vanessa would reflect on her time in the cage with a mix of fear and disbelief. The house remained unsold for a long time, its sinister reputation scaring off potential buyers. Eventually, it was purchased by a paranormal enthusiast who embraced its haunted history, turning it into a site for ghost tours and investigations. For Vanessa, however, the cage was a chapter she wished to close forever. She focused on raising her son and rebuilding her life, though she never forgot the harrowing experiences that had pushed her to the brink. The cage took a piece of me, she would later say in interviews, but it also made me stronger. I survived what most people would never believe, and that's something no ghost can ever take away. The divorcee who purchased the cage, Eleanor Hart, was a pragmatic woman in her early 50s. A seasoned professional in corporate finance, she viewed the tales surrounding the cage as nothing more than provincial folklore. She envisioned transforming the property into a peaceful retreat for herself and a lucrative rental space for tourists eager to visit a village steeped in history. "Every old house has its quirks," she remarked during a brief interview with a local paper. "What matters is turning a profit, not pandering to ghost stories." Eleanor's confidence seemed unshakable as she moved into the cage in late December. She spent the first few weeks overseeing renovations, determined to modernize the interior while retaining its historical charm. Contractors came and went, each with their own peculiar stories. A carpenter claimed his tools vanished only to reappear hours later in a completely different room. A painter swore he heard whispers when he worked alone. Eleanor dismissed the incidents as tricks of the mind. The first night Eleanor stayed in the cage, she felt an overwhelming chill despite the central heating running at full capacity. She wrapped herself in a blanket and poured a glass of wine, telling herself it was just an old house settling into its new chapter. But as the hours dragged on, the chill turned into an oppressive weight. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. Eleanor's sleep that night was restless. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and the faint sound of chains dragging across stone. She woke up at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of a baby crying, a sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She searched the house, her heart pounding, but found nothing. The next morning, Eleanor chalked it up to exhaustion and refused to entertain any notions of the supernatural. But over the following weeks, the disturbances escalated. Lights flickered without explanation. Doors slammed shut on their own. Eleanor began to feel a distinct presence in the house, particularly in the room she had designated as her home office. One evening, as she worked late on her laptop, the screen flickered and went black. When it powered back on, the words "Get out" were scrawled across a blank document. Eleanor stared at the screen, frozen, before slamming the laptop shut. Her skepticism began to waver after she invited a friend, Paula, to stay for the weekend. Paula was an amateur paranormal enthusiast who had long been fascinated by the stories surrounding the cage. Armed with a spirit box and a digital recorder, Paula conducted an impromptu investigation. The results were chilling. The spirit box emitted disjointed voices, including one that clearly whispered, "Help me." When Paula played back the recordings, both women heard a deep, guttural growl that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Despite these experiences, Eleanor refused to leave. She was determined to confront whatever force lingered in the cage. She began researching the history of the property in greater depth, uncovering stories that hadn't been widely reported. One account spoke of a midwife in the 1600s who was accused of witchcraft after a newborn in her care mysteriously died. Another told of a soldier from the English Civil War who was imprisoned in the cage and later executed, his ghost rumored to haunt the property seeking justice. Eleanor enlisted the help of a renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. Evelyn Carter, whose methods were both scientific and empathetic. Dr. Carter arrived with a small team equipped with thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recorders. Over the course of 3 nights, the team documented an array of phenomena: sudden temperature drops, unexplained orbs of light, and disembodied voices calling Eleanor's name. Dr. Carter concluded that the cage was a nexus of residual and intelligent hauntings. "The energy here is undeniable," she told Eleanor. Whatever lingers in this house is deeply tied to its history of suffering and injustice. Eleanor faced a choice: sell the cage once again, knowing the stigma would make it nearly impossible to find another buyer, or remain and attempt to coexist with the unseen forces. She chose the latter. In the months that followed, Eleanor adapted to life in the cage. She established boundaries with whatever entities resided there, speaking aloud to announce her presence and requesting peace. Remarkably, the disturbances lessened, though they never completely disappeared. Visitors to the cage continue to report strange occurrences, but Eleanor has grown accustomed to the house's eccentricities. "It's not a haunted house," she often says. "It's a house with a history, and like any history, it demands respect." Whether the cage's story ends with Eleanor remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the echoes of its past are far from silent.